Okay, so this evening I'm going to talk, my talk is called The Songs of Freedom. It's about breaking free of the three fetters and entering the stream. And it's part of a series of talks that we're doing. As you know, I hope, over the last year, we've been looking at Buddhism through time and space. So we've started 2,500 years ago in India. We've been all around the place. We've been to Tibet, China, Japan. And we've kind of finally landed here. And we're particularly talking in the next few weeks about how the person who founded Triratna Buddhist movement, this particular Buddhist movement, whose name is Sangharakshita, how he's translated some particular pieces of the Dharma for us today. Because obviously we have quite different situation, quite different conditioning perhaps, from people who lived 2,500 years ago in India, or people who lived 1,000 years ago in Tibet, or even people who lived, who were young in the 60s. It's like so what Sangharakshita's done is he's taken some particular things and he's particularly looked at those, and that's what we're looking at in these next few talks. So he's particularly looked at this idea of the three fetters. And what I'm talking about is based on a very famous talk that he's done, which is called Taste of Freedom. And it's really worth listening to on Free Buddhist Audio. There's also a lovely little booklet, which is called Taste of Freedom, that I meant to bring up actually, I forgot, but presumably it's in the bookshop. Yes. I don't know, it has been in the party. Yes, it is. Yes, great. And I do recommend it. I think it's kind of Sangharakshita on great form. And there's loads in that talk. I can't talk about everything that's in that talk tonight, so I'm just going to talk about a little bit of that. And I just wanted to say one thing actually, that sometimes you might hear me or other people talk about Sangharakshita as Bhante. And you might have wondered, what were people saying when they said that? Well, all Bhante means is it means teacher. So it's just a kind of, it sort of feels quite an affectionate and also quite a respectful way of referring to him. So if I slip into calling him Bhante, that's all I'm doing, is I'm just saying teacher. Just a way of saying teacher. Okay, and in some ways, Sangharakshita has, he's a bit like Padmasambhava was when Padmasambhava went to Tibet. So you might know that story about the figure of Padmasambhava, who's both a kind of real and a mythic archetypal figure, went to Tibet and needed to do what he could to get the Dharma to grow. He was invited by an emperor to help the Dharma to grow in Tibet. And he needed to translate the Dharma into ways that Tibetans would understand. And so the kind of mythic story goes that there were lots of demons. Every day, the demons would destroy at night the monastery that people were building in the day. So they'd work really hard in the day, go to bed, come back, and all these demons had taken it all down. So what Padmasambhava was able to do was he was able to work with the demons, get them on his side. So some of the demons he actually used a bit of force to kind of subdue. He kind of spoke to them in their own terms. Some of the demons he seduced to get on his side as well. So in the end, he had the demons coming out in the middle of the night to build the monastery, so they got it built double quick. So I'm not quite sure what Sangharakshita's way of coping with our demons, perhaps in the West, is. It's quite an interesting question. But in some ways, like Padmasambhava had to translate Buddhism for Tibet, Sangharakshita is one. I mean, there are obviously other figures who are translating Buddhism for us in the West, and he's one of those figures. So, in the talk, Taste of Freedom, Sangharakshita asks a very good question. He asks the question, what is Buddhism? Which is quite a good question if you plan to start a major Buddhist movement, to kind of know from the beginning what it is. And I think very interestingly, what he says is that until about 100 years ago, actually, well, probably about 140 years ago now, there was no such thing as a Buddhism. Because the Buddha didn't call it Buddhism. It's only when Westerners started translating Buddhism, started translating the Dharma and bringing it to the West, that they called it Buddhism. They made it an ism. Before that, it was called the Dharma Vinaya. That's how the Buddha referred to what he was about. So that's Dharma Vinaya. Dharma you've probably come across before. Dharma is the teaching of the Buddha, so it's kind of the principles. And Vinaya is a code. So it's a code that monks live by, but more than that, it's the kind of practice. So basically, when he said, when the Buddha talked about what we call Buddhism, he talked about the principle and the practice. which I think is quite interesting because Buddhism can sometimes feel a bit kind of like it's very much a label, isn't it? It's perhaps a bit limiting, and it can become a bit of a thing, I suppose. Whereas this is very much a kind of, it's a process, it's a practice, it's the principle, and it's how we put it into practice. So, in a very famous talk that the Buddha himself gave, that Sangharakshita refers to, the Buddha says, so what is the Dharma Vinaya? And he likens the Dharma Vinaya to the ocean, to the ocean, to the great ocean. And it's interesting because probably the Buddha and his followers hadn't ever seen the ocean. But they'd seen the Ganges, which is a big river, but they hadn't actually seen the ocean. But they obviously had an idea of what it was like. So the Buddha said quite a few things about the way that what the ocean is like and how the Dharma Vinaya is like that. And one is that, for instance, as you get into the ocean, the Buddha thought that it was very gradual, okay, which it obviously isn't always, but that's how he saw it, it's very gradual. And that's how it is getting into the Dharma Vinaya. It's gradual. We do it step by step. It's a gradual process. A second thing that he said was that in the ocean there are many treasures. There's gold, there's silver, there's all sorts of treasures. And the Dharma Vinaya is like that as well. It's full of all sorts of treasures. So it's full of the Four Noble Truths, it's full of the Noble Eightfold Path, of meditation, ethics, of wisdom. All those different teachings. The ocean is full of these wonderful things, these treasures. And the third one that he said is that the ocean has one taste. Just as the ocean has one taste, which is the taste of salt, so the Dharma Vinaya has one taste, which is the taste of freedom. So just as the ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, the Dharma Vinaya has one taste, which is the taste of freedom. And he said, in fact, that if whatever's in that ocean isn't leading to liberation, isn't leading to freedom, it's not the Dharma Vinaya, it's not the Buddha's teaching. So how you can tell if something is the Buddha's teachings is if it leads to freedom, to liberation. And actually I love this particular simile, I think it is, because it's very kind of, well, it's taste. Do you know what I mean? It's experience. It's like the taste of salt. It's like I can imagine that taste of the ocean. And it's a bit like our experience of the Dharma is an experience. It's not something we think about. Well, it is something we think about, but it's also something that we just taste, we just get. And I just think it's a lovely way to talk about it. It's very kind of visceral, I suppose. It's kind of the body. Okay, so it has the taste of salt, which is the same as the taste of freedom, the taste of liberation. So freedom has certainly been for me something that I've yearned for throughout my life, actually. It's been quite a pull. It's something that I've particularly lived by, I think, is looking for freedom. And freedom to do what? To go where I want to go, to be what I want to be, do what I want to do, love who I want, those kind of things. I've also been particularly kind of, I suppose, lack of freedom in other people's lives is something that strikes me. You know, many people live lives with not much freedom, whether that's because of poverty, whether that's because of the kind of country that they're living in, the rules that they're living in. You know, through history there's been quite a lack of freedom. So it's interesting that actually I'm living in a world where I think I objectively have a lot of freedom, especially nowadays. It's like I seem to have quite a lot of freedom to do what I want to do. But actually, there's still a lack of freedom, because I've got a lack of mental freedom. It's like I'm bound by various different fetters. So although I'm free to do what I want and go where I want, pretty much, I'm actually bound in some ways. I think it's William Blake, the poet, talked about mind-made manacles. And it's a bit like I live with these mind-made manacles. And yeah, it's a bit like we live in a prison, I think. We live in a prison and we're quite restricted and limited by all sorts of views and ideas. And of course, some people are quite happy in the prison. Some people just set about making the prison, you know, better. And as Sangharakshita says, some people just write things on the walls. Some people even write rude things on the walls as a way to kind of rebel about being in the prison. But I suppose what the Dharma Vinaya, what Buddhism is about, is we're trying to get out of the prison altogether. We're trying to get out of that prison of having a restricted sense of ourself, a restricted sense of views. We're trying to get rid of this almost existential sense of being bound, of being shackled. So the kind of freedom we talk about goes beyond the kind of idea of freedom of being just free to do what I want. It's actually a whole emancipation from these fetters. And there are 10 fetters altogether actually leading up to enlightenment, but we're just talking about 3 today. So it's emancipation from the bondage of our views. And the word for that in Pali and in Sanskrit, so in Sanskrit it's vimukti, and in Pali it's vimutti. And this is this sense of freedom, liberation, emancipation. And in terms of its place in the kind of scheme of spiritual development, it's very high. It's the penultimate stage before full enlightenment. But although that's true, I think we can also very much get a taste of it in our own lives. Every time we go beyond ourselves, we can start to get a taste of that freedom. But what happens in our practice is that at some point our progress becomes irreversible. And what happens is we break these first 3 fetters of the 10, and we become what's called a stream entrant. So we enter into the stream. And I think that's quite a poetic image in a way that gives the idea of that we're, at the moment, having not entered the stream, it's like I need to work against things quite a lot of the time. But once I've entered into the stream, I'll just be carried along by its momentum. Whatever my conditions are, whatever happens to me, I'll just keep practicing. What I'll do is I'll no longer be caught up in kind of self-obsession, self-referential living. I'll move away from that and I'll move much more to a life where I'm interconnected with others, where I'm feeling part of a much bigger world, not being obsessed with myself all the time. So that's a stream entrant. They've broken these 3 fetters. Okay. So what are these 3 fetters? So if you imagine you're kind of getting into this stream, okay, and you're going on the way down to the ocean, but you're getting into the stream, and as you get into the stream, you get caught up in some nasty bits of weed that wrap them around your legs, and you can't move, you can't do anything, okay? So that's what the fetters are. And there's another image as well, actually, which I've kind of used, which might be a bit easier, which is the idea that we could be like a kind of balloon, and we're held back by the fetters. And I've drawn a sort of diagram of it. Okay, I don't know how much you can read at the back. But here's us, balloon, and we're on the way to freedom. The balloon's on the way up into the clear blue sky. Freedom, liberation, potentiality. But we're held back by this kind of plait of ropes, all messed up together, tied down with a big weight. And in Bante's terms, the 3 things that keep us tied down are habit, superficiality, and vagueness. And that's what this talk's really going to explore, those 3 things. Okay, so these 3 fetters. Okay, so they're a traditional, what Bante's done, Sangharakshita's done, is there are different ways they're described. So there's the traditional one, which is just a translation of what was in the Pali canon, which is belief in a fixed self-view is the first fetter. And Sangharakshita's translated that as habit, and then he's talked about creativity as a way out of that. So what happens is if we do break these 3 fetters, success is assured, okay? Once we've broken through, that balloon will just go up into the air and we will move towards enlightenment. It'll be like it will have sufficient momentum, we'll be unstoppable. And Sangharakshita says it's a completely realistic goal that we break those 3 fetters in this lifetime. There's no reason why we shouldn't do that. So, how do they hold us back? How might we weaken them? So let's look at this fixed self-view, this idea of habits. So habits. So Sangharakshita says that actually we are our actions in many ways, and our actions are often just based on habits. You know, there's all sorts of things we do all the time just because that's what we do. You know, whether it's very mundane things about what we eat for breakfast, or whether it's how we are actually with people. So it's a bit like, in a way, you could say a person is a sum of their habits. So if you talk about a person, if you talk about George or Mary, in a way you might be talking about just that collection of habits. You know, George has got a bit of a bad temper, but he can be quite kind. Mary's got a good sense of humour, but you know, sometimes she's a bit late for things. They're just habits that these people have got into. And we ourselves are a bit like that. We just can be just our habits. It's a bit like, you'll remember from the first or second week of the newcomers, it's like our habits live us. We're not actually in charge of what's going on in our lives. We're being lived by these habits. And Sangharakshita says that often actually we're probably a bad habit. We're a collection of bad habits. And it's a bit like we're a certain stream of consciousness and we've kind of got into a knot and we've just stopped there, and we don't have to. We can untie that knot and we can actually be much more freer. We can actually change. So what he says as the way to counteract this habits that we can get into is creativity. So he means creativity there in the broadest sense. What he's saying is we can actually, in every moment, be creating ourselves. So when we're stuck in habits, what we're doing is we're stuck in that rut. You might remember again from the newcomers that we go round and round in a circle if we're not careful. And we just deepen this rut. And we're just like this habit, you know, that every time after a meal always has a cigarette. You know, whatever it is. Always shouts at their children or something. Do you know what I mean? It's just like we're just this habit that goes round. And what the Buddha said was actually that we can actually change those. We can gradually become much more creative. We don't have to be defined by what we were in the past. But it's not that easy to change these habits, as we know. I mean, you probably all remember that we talked about being in the gap as a really good way to learn how to change the habits. That actually once, if we're in that gap, we can make a creative decision about what we do. We don't always have to do what we did before, we can make a creative decision. But it's not easy to change, and there are several reasons why. I think one is other people. So other people often have ideas of how we are. And I'm really struck by a few people I know who used to be at Sheffield Buddhist Centre, and they live in other places now. And I occasionally see them maybe once every 6 months or something. And I realise how much they've changed. And actually I have to slightly change the way I talk to them. And it's interesting because I kind of go in with one idea of them, and then I realise, oh no, actually this person is a lot softer, for instance, than she was before. She's a different person. And it's a bit like if I wasn't careful, I would be defining her as she was before. And I think we particularly notice this with families, well I do anyway. You know, however hard I try, often when I'm with my mum, I seem to be about 13, kind of sulking and kind of doing all this like rolling of my eyes and stuff like that. Even though, you know, I'm 52, and but it's just like, you know, I behave in this kind of pattern. And I don't even think she's doing it, I just think it's really hard for me. It's such a deep conditioning that it's really hard to break out of that. And that kind of links to another thing, which means it's hard to change or be creative, which I found really useful when I first heard it, which is the idea of the fishwives of basket. Okay, so the story is there's a fishwife, and every week she goes into market with her fish and sells them at the market. And one day she's late. The market goes on late, and it's dark. She doesn't want to have to walk back to her home. So her friend the florist says, "Oh, well, come and stay in my shop. You can sleep in the shop, and then you can go home in the morning." So she does that. And the next morning the florist says, "Oh, so how did you sleep?" And the fishwife says, "Oh, at first I just couldn't get to sleep at all. The smell of those flowers was awful. So what I did is I got my basket and I put my head in that, the basket that carried the fish in, and that's the smell that I like, and then I could sleep really well." And I certainly really relate to that there are all sorts of things I do that sometimes I move away from them and I just come back to them. It's like I prefer them, even though they cause me suffering, even though they're unpleasant. So I think, you know, in terms of us changing, there are things to work against. I think one of the things that really helps is to realise how much we're influenced by our conditions. So it's very hard to change by just willpower alone, as you probably all know. But what can help you change is putting yourself in conditions where there are people who are behaving in the way that you'd like to behave, or at least have taken on to do that, or where you're, it's quite positive conditions actually, where maybe it's something like going on a retreat for a couple of weeks. If you can do that, we can go to a beautiful place where you can be meditating a lot. You can actually, I've really felt how much I've changed. I was lucky enough to have a 3-month retreat, and I could really feel how much I changed on that because I was in very different conditions from my everyday life. So I think realising how important our conditions are, and obviously we all have various commitments that might mean we can't dramatically change our conditions, but we can put little bits of things into our life to remind ourselves of what we'd like to be changing into. We can, if we're meditating in the morning, if we're reading a bit of Dharma, if we maybe at work make time to think about what are we trying to do with our lives, all those things will help us to change, help us to be more creative, to be in that gap, to be creative, and to no longer just be a collection of habits, but actually to be a creative individual who's very open to the world. I think that's my kind of idea of what this creative individual would be like. They'd be very open, very responsive. At the moment, I'm quite often reactive, so it's like, someone has a certain haircut, and I have a particular view of them, for instance. I mean, that's a silly example, but you know what I mean? It's just like, I will react to things. Whereas I imagine this person who's very responsive and open to what's actually going on. Okay. So that's the first one. So the second one is doubt. Oh, actually, maybe we shouldn't do that one now. Maybe we should go to... Oh, no, I don't know. Let's go back. I don't know. There you go. That's what doubt does to you, doesn't it? Doubt and indecision. It means that you just spend a whole load of time kind of just faffing about, basically, instead of getting on with it. So it's traditionally called doubt and indecision. And Sangharakshita calls it vagueness, which is quite interesting, being vague. And actually being vague can be a way to kind of get through life a bit sometimes, Somebody asks you a question, well, you don't quite answer it, you're a bit vague. You don't quite commit yourself. You don't say, no, actually, I don't want to do that. You're just like, well, I don't know, we'll see, that kind of thing. It's just like you don't quite commit. So Sangharakshita suggests that the way to work with this particular fetter is through commitment. And I don't think the Buddha is talking about sort of good, honest doubt. That's not a problem. In fact, the Buddha says in one of the, that if you want to test out some of his teachings, the way to do that is a bit like a person would test gold. They'd bite gold to see if it was real. So test it out, see if it works. But there is a bit of testing out in there. Do you see what I mean? It's trying it out to see if it works. Not just kind of having a sort of sceptical, well, I don't know, is it worth it kind of doubt just from the beginning. And in fact, I think, anything we want to do, commitment really helps. And I suppose it's a bit like, if we keep our options open, we feel like we're keeping things open for us, but we never actually do anything. And Vidania used to have a really good image of if you don't make a commitment, it's like you've got one foot on the land and one foot in the boat. And that's a really uncomfortable place to be, okay? So you just kind of, you can either stay on the land, that's fine, or just get in the boat. So, just get in the stream and do it. And I think, so what we need to do is whatever we're doing, really, not just our spiritual life, but to make commitments. And actually, of course, we live in a world where there's loads of choice, and actually choice is seen as a really good thing. But you've probably all had experience about how sometimes having too much choice can make it very difficult to do anything. And in a kind of small way, I've got one which is, occasionally I think, I'd like to watch a film tonight, and I've kind of got iPlayer on my computer, and all these different films I could watch, and all these different things. And I spend ages going, I could watch that one. I go, I don't know if that's very good, and then I could watch that one. And then it's kind of time to stop, it's like I haven't watched a film. And, in the olden days, I'd just watch whatever was on the telly, and it would just be, that was it, So it's a bit like, that can happen in our lives in a big way as well. If we never commit, life goes by. And how might that work in our spiritual life? Well, I suppose it's things like, we might sit down to meditate and we go, which practice should I be doing? Should I be doing mindfulness, metta, just sitting? I've heard about all these other amazing practices that people do. Maybe I should do one of those. Oh, okay, maybe I'm not like learning from the right teacher. Maybe I'm not Buddhist. I mean, all those kind of questions, and they're fine. But at some point, you've got to, if you want to do something, you need to decide that you are going to stick with one thing. You know, there are lots of different paths, but if you take all the different paths, you never get there. You know, you need to take one path, whatever it is. So, and also I think behind my lack of commitment is often I don't want to have to give things up because I have got so much choice. It's a bit like I'm worried about if I do A, well, I won't be able to do all those other things. If I go to that weekend, I won't be able to do these things. Do you see what I mean? And it's like part, I think, of making a commitment is being prepared not to do some things as well and making that decision. Okay, so the third fetter is traditionally known as dependence on rites and rituals. And Sangharakshita has called that superficiality, and the way through that is clarity. So dependence on rules and ritual, or dependence on moral rules and observances, it's called something. And actually, the rites and rituals in themselves are not a problem, they're fine. Okay? It's the dependence that's the problem. So I suppose you may well have had experience of certain kind of religious practices which seem to become just about, you just do it because that's what you do, you know. And actually it's interesting, I mean obviously I try not to do this, but sometimes someone will ask me, so why do you do that thing where you bow in that way or something? And I go, I don't know. And I realise I'm just doing it as a rite and ritual. And it's great to have that question actually, because then I think about, well, why do I do it? You know, what is the reason behind it? So, I suppose in all of our lives, it can be all those things we do just because that's how you do it. And I think Sangharakshita calls it superficiality, because that's when we do things from the surface of ourselves, without thoroughness. So, you know, it's when you're just kind of doing something just for the sake of it, going through the motions, that kind of a feeling. And I suppose the reasons for that can be complicated, but one of them is that we're actually quite divided, we're not integrated. So you might have heard people talk about this word integrated, which is the idea that we try and get as much of ourself behind whatever it is we're doing. And superficiality can come from when we're divided, we're not integrated. Our unconscious emotional depth might be divided from what's going on consciously. We're not actually acting with the whole of ourselves. And sometimes actually we do things, but our unconscious doesn't actually approve. You know, it's actually, it would rather we did something else. And yeah, so I think that can lead to a kind of life where you're not quite living somehow. And I think that's where the practice of awareness, mindfulness, can be so important, because then you're actually becoming aware of what's really going on for you. And you can start to try and bring more and more of you to every situation. And sometimes the situation we're in is actively painful, and sometimes it's just boring, okay, or not much is happening. And what we can do is take on just to engage with that boredom and not to pull away from the pain as much as we can. And that's the commitment we're looking for. That's what we're doing in order not to be superficial, is we actually try to be there as much as we can with whatever's happening. And then we actually begin to feel more and more like we're actually living our lives. And I think clarity is really important here, because it's a bit like you ask that question, you know, well, why am I doing this? Why am I here in this room doing this at the moment? Why do I do all the things in my life? What are they about? And through that question you can start to kind of get through superficiality. Okay, so we go back to the picture. It's a bit like habit, superficiality, vagueness. They're all connected in lots of ways. And you know, if you work on one of those, you will start to break the others. It's said that if you break one fetter, you break all three. And so by becoming more creative, by becoming more committed, by developing clarity, we can start to break them, and we can move up into freedom. Okay, but before I finish, I just want to talk a little bit about I suppose a danger that goes around. So I've talked about a model, which is the model of there being a stream entrant. A stream entrant is this being who's let go of these three fetters and who is moving inexorably towards enlightenment. And I think there's lots of different models that talk about spiritual progress or how we move spiritually, how we change. And sometimes we can take them too literally. And actually I fell into it this morning because I was looking at, we've kind of got several different models going on here, and I started to go, hang on, that doesn't fit with that, I need to look it up. And I thought, hang on, I've taken it too literally. Okay? So it's not like we need to kind of go, wow, I think I've broken half this fetter and a bit of that, and I'm kind of not quite in the stream or something like that. And then there are stages after becoming a stream entrant where you become a once returner and then you become a non-returner and all this kind of stuff. And I think that's kind of a useful model. But if we take it literally, we're actually sunk, okay? Because we're actually then going to start grasping after these attainments and these ways of being. And just the whole fact that we're grasping after attainments means that we're going to sink in that stream. We're not going to be carried along by it. We're actually going to go to the bottom of it. Because, of course, we'll start to get really self-obsessed with ourselves, what our attainments are, where we are, how we're different from other people. And interestingly, the very last fetter, well, the next to last fetter to go, is one that's called conceit, which is later on than this. And conceit is comparing yourself to others, either thinking you're better than others, or thinking you're worse than others. And it's interesting that that's one of the very last ones to go. And I think we have to be quite careful in our spiritual development that we don't get too caught up in either thinking we're better or others, or less than others. So in a way, though, people say, okay, that's interesting, but Sangharakshita said we can become stream entrants in our lifetime. So wouldn't it be great to know if there were some people who said they were stream entrants, and then we'd know we could do it. And I can see that as well. But I think what we need is a kind of middle way, where we kind of see around us that people are actually becoming kinder, more open, more flexible. They're kind of the kind of people you want to be around more. And that's happening. And instead of kind of getting caught up about our own attainments and where we are, or defining ourselves by our attainments, we just don't take it too literally. There's a fantastic, completely mind-blowing piece of the Mahayana, which is a later teaching than this, which is called the Diamond Sutra. And in the Diamond Sutra, it's asked, it says, does it occur to the stream enterer, does it occur to him or her, am I a stream entrant? And in that it says, no, should it occur to him or her, I am a stream entrant, they are not, by definition, a stream entrant. So it's wonderfully paradoxical. It's kind of just trying to cut underneath that fact that we might cling on to, we might start claiming something. And I suppose what we're trying to do is just generally make our spiritual life irreversible. So we're not pulled back by other things, so that our life flows on. And we don't let it get hijacked by craving and aversion, or our longing for certainty, our wanting to have all these things kind of set out so neatly. In a way, just forget about it. So just put ourselves into the Dharma. And I think it's interesting that, from what I understand, what stream entrants do is they don't go, hooray, I'm a stream entrant. They just actually get full of gratitude, because they realise how connected they are with other beings, and how actually all they are is made up of things that other beings have given to them. So it's not a sense of attainment that they feel, it's a sense of gratitude. What's really important is that we're opening out, not that we're cutting down and that we're making distinctions. So hopefully we can be moving ourselves towards freedom, towards liberation, and having more and more of this taste of freedom, this taste of salt in our lives. For ourselves and for others. And the reason I called it Songs of Freedom is because there's a song, Redemption Song by Bob Marley, that I'm sure you all know. It's one of my favourite songs. And in it, let me just find the actual quote, basically he says, someone will know it, even if I don't know it right now. He says, emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. Yeah, thank you. And I think, and he says, will you sing our song of freedom? So I suppose what we're inviting us all to do is to sing our songs of freedom.